Hello everyone, and welcome to Network Labs. Today in this video, I will share the basic configuration of a Cisco router. These configurations are very essential before deploying the router to a production environment. Let us begin and configure the Cisco router in the diagram. It is connected to a management for testing purposes of some configurations. First, clean up the router by resetting it to factory default. One way to do it is by erasing the configuration file stored in the NV RAM. Issue the command erase startup config or erase NV RAM. Upon erasing the startup configurations, reload the router. Upon boot up, the router is now ready for configuration, and we are on the user exec mode. Let us start the basic configuration. Issue the command enable to enter the privileged exec mode. Next, type configure terminal to enter the configuration mode. Set the router name. Type host name followed by the desired router name. Next, it is optional, but if you want not to be disconnected from the console, you can adjust the default exec timeout. Enter the console interface. Then input the desired timeout value. Next, assign a default DNS domain. Type the command IP domain name followed by the domain name. Then assign a single or list of DNS servers. Issue the command IP name server followed by the DNS server addresses. Now connect the router to the Internet and test if it can resolve domains. By the way, if you want these logs to not appear while doing some configurations, issue the command no logging console. The logs do not appear anymore on the console. Now connect the router to the Internet and test if it can resolve domains. The router can now resolve domain names. Next, let us configure a system login banner, or MOTD. Issue the command banner MOTD, then a delimiter character to specify the start and end of the text banner. Then type the message. The banner MOTD now appears upon login on the router. Next, encrypt system passwords, so that in the showrun command, the device no longer displays the password in humanly readable format. Issue the command service password encryption. As you can see, by default, there is no required password upon logging in on the router. Set a password to enter privileged or exec mode. Enable password is now required. and it is encrypted. Next, set the username and password. This is different from the enable password. Now let us configure the VTY lines for remote management of the router. Type the command, line VTY followed by line number or range. We'll configure 5 lines for now. Set which protocols are allowed to access the virtual terminal lines. Let us allow SSH only. Next, configure login to specify the type of authentication when connecting to the VTY lines. You can use login only, but a password is needed to be configured. Type login followed by local, so the username and password are required. Or login followed by authentication default, so that all authentication attempts on the device will use local database credentials. For now, let us use login followed by local to use the configured username and password on the router. Next, configure transport preferred none to prevent typos at the command line from causing a bogus DNS lookup. Edit the history size buffer to control how many historical command lines are available when you use the up arrow and down arrow keys to scroll through past command lines. For additional security, let us configure an access list to control the connection to the VTY lines. Let us allow the network address for management only. Then apply the access list to the VTY lines. Apply it inbound. Here you can also use VRF also keyword to allow incoming connections on the VTY line from a different VRF. Let us continue and enable SSH globally. First, create RSA key for SSH encryption. Use 2048 for the size of the key modulus. Once the key is generated, we can now proceed and enable SSH. Specify the timeout interval for SSH connections in seconds. Limit number of authentication retries. Next, let us disable some services depending on the purpose of the router, starting with HTTP service. Then the HTTP secure services. You can disable the other services on the screen if necessary. Save the running configuration to the NVRAM. Now, let us verify if the SSH connection to the router will succeed. Open a PuTTY or any other terminal emulator. Connect to the assigned management IP address. The connection is successful. A username with password is required. Input the configured credentials. SSH connection is successful. Now, if we remove the login local command under the VTY interface, the connection is refused. Let us continue with the other basic configurations. Enable IPv6 on the router. This will allow us to configure IPv6 protocols, addresses, and services. Next, let us go to the interface configurations. Enter a specific interface. Configure a description. Enable IPv6. Then input both the assigned IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. It is optional, but for some security purposes, input the following commands under the interface. First, disable proxy ARP. Disable sending ICMP redirects on this interface. Disable translation of directed broadcast to physical broadcast. Enable the interface. Issue the command show running interface followed by the interface port to view its current configurations. For troubleshooting purposes, the duplexing, speed, and media type of the interface can be modified. Type show interface followed by the interface port to view other important details. Here, you can see the status, physical or MAC address, description, IP address, MTU, duplexing, input and output rate for bits and packets, and errors. Append transceiver details on the Show Interface command to view the optical port information. The result should look like this. You can view the temperature, voltage, current, optical transmit, and receive power. The threshold values are also shown. Next, issue the command show IPv6 interface brief to view the IPv6 addresses. Next, for more flexibility and security, let us enable basic AAA or authentication, authorization, and accounting. By default, it is disabled. Currently, the login local is configured for remote connection. Enable AAA to allow external authentications like a RADIUS server. Upon enabling, the login local command automatically disappears. Input the command AAA authentication login, followed by default local then group RADIUS. This command tells to use local first, then RADIUS authentication. If a RADIUS server is used, input RADIUS first before the local command. The router is now accessible via AAA authentication method locally. Now, if a RADIUS server is available, issue the following commands. First, RADIUS server followed by the desired name, then the server address of the RADIUS server. Followed by the authorization and authentication ports. Here, I have assigned the port numbers different from the default. Then, the timeout value. Define the server key. Next, configure VRF for the management interface. Type VRF definition, followed by the name. Then activate both IPv4 and IPv6 address families. Next, bind the management interface to the VRF. Upon configuration of a VRF to an interface, any IP address configured will be automatically removed. Reconfigure the IP address or obtain it via DHCP. After a few seconds, the interface obtains an IP address again. And still reachable. Next, configure NTP server to synchronize the time of the device. Input NTP server, followed by the IP address. We'll use Google NTP server address for now. Upon NTP configuration, the status is now synchronized. Next, set up the clock time zone. For additional management and monitoring, configure SNMP services. Configure the community string. Then, define the SNMP server address and version. Upon configuration, SNMP services is now working. I hope that this is informative to you, and thank you for watching.